Well, Chris, we've just had a very successful conference on Saturday, Spooked, looking at cultures of intelligence in the Cold War. How did you manage to get such a great lineup of speakers to come and speak at Warwick?
Well, we were extremely fortunate in who we actually managed to get to the conference. We had Professor Richard Aldrich, the current chair of the politics department at Nottingham University. Richard is in fact joining the Warwick politics department in September. Professor Anthony Glees, the director for intelligence studies at Brunel University, again another one of the founding fathers of the intelligence discipline. I guess principally these characters are very keen to disseminate their research. They're often sort of involved with liaison with ministers, and they're very keen to disseminate their research both inside and outside of the ivory tower.
Do you think that current controversies, we know recently about the 7/7 Commission and problems about picking up Islamic terrorism in Britain, has that generated an interest in Cold War intelligence?
Certainly there is absolutely no doubt that a conference on intelligence is timely. The steady release of new documentation, accelerated by the end of the Cold War and the recently emergent Freedom of Information Act, has done much to ameliorate a subject that was once memorably described as the missing dimension in diplomatic history. Threats to international security in the wake of the Iraq War and 7/7, coupled with the sort of alleged manipulation or doctoring of intelligence historiography, sexing up to employ the idiom, have further stimulated and to some extent inflected academic debates.
Do you think there's also a popular dimension? I mean, we've just seen Casino Royale with James Bond making a comeback. Isn't that part of the answer about why we're so interested in spies in this country?
Well, Bond is certainly a wonderful vehicle for recruitment. The very first Bond novel, of course, published in the early 1950s, rehabilitated, I think, the image of the Secret Intelligence Service in the wake of the Burgess and Maclean defections. And similarly, in 2007, in the light of this sort of alleged politicisation of intelligence historiography, coupled with the intelligence failings of the Iraq War, Bond emerges at precisely the right moment for Britain's intelligence community.
I guess one of the really interesting things which came out of the conference was this blurred line between fact and fiction. The fact that spies themselves are generating cover stories, a form of fiction themselves, but how do we disentangle fact from fiction in these stories which spies are telling about themselves?
It's fascinating, isn't it, that some of the signature spy fiction authors of the Cold War were intimately involved with intelligence work at some stage in their career. Ian Fleming famously worked for naval intelligence during the Second World War, actually orchestrated the development of this 40-unit assault squad, a crack SOE type organisation that operated in North Africa during the Second World War. And authors such as John le Carré and Len Dayson also were intimately involved with intelligence work again at some stage in their career.
Yeah. And we also know that one of our speakers is famously, or perhaps not so famously, the official historian of MI5, which is coming up to its centenary. Seems now that some of these espionage agencies, these intelligence services, are coming out of the shadows a little. Do you think that British intelligence is now more publicly accountable than it was during the Cold War?
The issue of openness is absolutely crucial. It's worth pointing out that during the Cold War itself, both MI5, the security service, and MI6, the secret intelligence service, had no official peacetime existence. And as one of our speakers, Richard Aldrich, memorably pointed out in the conference, sort of writing to them during the Cold War was like sending messages to Father Christmas. They simply didn't exist. Their buildings were blanks on an ordnance survey map.
As an East German historian, I'm really lucky that I'm spoilt for riches with Stasi files. They're all open since the fall of the wall. But how do you find it as a British historian? Is there anything there in the archives?
Well, historians of intelligence have got various methodological strategies available to them. As Richard Aldrich argued in his keynote address, scholars can grow their own records by conducting interviews with practitioners of the intelligence community. They can also go to what he calls, or what he called in the conference, history supermarkets, such as the National Archives, by using freedom of information requests. And as Christopher Andrew has argued in the past, historians can also glean information from adjacent records, such as Treasury, Home Office, and Foreign Office files.
Well, we've now had 10 years of the Blair administration. Intelligence were quite controversial 4 years ago, at the time of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, has there been a danger, do you think, of intelligence getting too close to government in terms of famously sexing up the dossier on weapons of mass destruction? Has intelligence learned to distance itself from the government?
Yes, of course, one of the big questions to come out of the conference was to what extent are the intelligence services acting, if you like, as interlocutors between different sections of government and the core executive. One of our speakers, however, also pointed out that they might increasingly be operating as a maverick or rogue organisation, in effect a state within a state. So this also impinges under the Blair administration of whether we are in fact living in a surveillance society, or what Peter Hennessy calls a new protective state.
This involves huge resources which possibly bankrupted the East German state. Is it possible for British intelligence to devote that level of surveillance to the threats which face it in the 21st century?
Well, MI5 certainly only has finite resources. As one of our speakers estimated, by 2008, MI5 will have somewhere in the region of 3,800 officers in operation, and of course this is nowhere near the levels achieved by the Stasi. Perhaps it's worth remembering, if you like, a Foucauldian metaphor, that the intelligence services like to be all-seeing without ever being seen.
And finally, do you think that the real difference since the Cold War is that an East-West conflict has essentially been replaced by a North-South conflict?
I think perhaps one of the biggest differences between the Cold War and the new terrorist threat that we face in 2007 is that for the intelligence services during the Cold War, they arguably knew the enemy's capability. This was the essence, if you like, of mutually assured destruction and deterrence. What they didn't always know were the intentions of the enemy. So arguably in 2007, we've seen a reversal of this. The intelligence services arguably recognise the intentions of the enemy, but what they're not always aware of are its capability.